If you fast forward 6 years, when Gough Whitlam is elected the Labor Prime Minister, and shortly after his election you have the Christmas bombing in 1972 by the Americans. Now, many of Whitlam's senior ministers, such as Tom Uren, Clyde Cameron, Jim Cairns, they said some pretty provocative things about President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, that they were madmen and maniacs, and this must have really, thugs, they must have really changed the nature of the relationship somewhat. To what extent?
As the Secretary of State at the time, Rogers said to the Australian ambassador in Washington, Sir James Plimsoll, you know, when the going gets tough, we expect our friends to stick around. Now, the Americans were absolutely livid. It wasn't quite as bad as what the Swedish had said. The Swedish had made comparisons between Nixon and Hitler.
Is that a fact?
That's right.
But of course the Swedish didn't have that security alliance with the Americans either.
No, that's right. I mean, I really do think it was the most severe censure from one of America's friends and allies. So, look, the upshot is that for 4 months, there are two consequences. One is more closely allied to symbolism, and that is the fact that for 4 months Richard Nixon held off on inviting Gough Whitlam to the White House. Wow. And it became a matter of real political debate in Australia, to the point where you had Andrew Peacock, you know, who was a young conservative spokesman on foreign relations at the time, and others writing to the American administration, visiting Washington and saying to them, for goodness sake, please allow Whitlam to come and visit your president, because this will that's right, it'll damage the alliance. The alliance is greater than any one party, and eventually, you know, through the work of Whitlam's private secretary Walensky, the American ambassador in Australia Marshall Green, and a number of others, Nixon agrees to finally meet Whitlam. But you know, jumping forward a bit, Nixon, 1 month before he is has to resign from office.
Around July 1974.
Correct. Commissions the National Security Council to do an in-depth study of policy towards Australia, in which he asks them to consider options for relocating the US military installations in Australia elsewhere, for also cutting off the intelligence feed to Australia. Now, you know, that is akin. If you can consider someone in hospital on life support in terms of the intelligence feed, that is akin to sort of cutting them off at the drip, turning the button off.
That's right.
And also for exploring options for growing US policy and Australian policy divergence in Asia. And there were more than a few senior US officials at this time who were saying, you know what, if we're going to get this sort of truculence from a small to middle power like Australia, we might have to consider whether or not this ANZUS treaty is really all that worthwhile, and especially if the Australians were going to walk away from CETO. Now, CETO was dribbling along to its demise at this time, but it was the rationale for the US bases in Thailand. And they didn't appreciate Whitlam coming out and saying that CETO was moribund. And so they said, you want to start talking about moribund alliances, you better be careful of the snowballing effect this might have on ANZUS.
Nevertheless, the alliance survives throughout the late 70s, throughout the 80s, but in the late 80s, early 90s, we see the end of the Cold War, the collapse of Soviet communism, and yet no serious commentator, diplomat, political leader is even contemplating the idea of jettisoning the alliance, even though the alliance was born during the heights of the Cold War. Why, James, when 40 years after the containment doctrine was launched, that there was no real cries for jettisoning the alliance? And why has it continued now for 20 odd years later?
Well, I don't think there were any cries for jettisoning the alliance, but there certainly was a change in tone. I mean, the great achievement of Whitlam, I think, was to establish this sense of Australia acting more independently within and without the alliance. It was essentially continued by Malcolm Fraser and, of course, by Hawke. I mean, remember throughout the 80s, Hayden and Hawke criticised the American invasion of Grenada. They criticised the American support for the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. They take their own line on peace and disarmament issues. They refuse to join up with Reagan's SDI, the Star Wars Missile Defence Initiative.
So clearly some qualified support here. Very qualified support for the Americans during the Hawke era.
Yeah, definitely. He talks very loudly about Americans and Australians being together forever. He's conscious of the fact that Labor has been so often associated with anti-Americanism. And I think the other interesting point about this period will be, and we'll have to wait for the documents to come out for this, is to what extent did this original concept of APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, what extent is it true that Hawke originally envisaged that as not involving the Americans.
Right.
And I mean, you look at Hawke's language on the Gulf War in supporting the first Gulf War. I mean, this was an international coalition led by the United States, but the language
But it had the
Hawke
backing
used,
of the United Nations.
That's right. The language Hawke used was liberal internationalist language.
Whereas 12 years later, for another war in the Middle East, the war to overthrow Saddam Hussein, the Labor Party in opposition opposed it on the grounds that it didn't have the support of the United Nations, correct?
That's right. And I think really in that post-96 period, I mean, there you see another change. I mean, I think in
the election
of John Howard as Prime Minister, I mean, Howard was very much of the view, I think, that previous Labor governments had perhaps sacrificed some of the closeness or the intimacy of the relationship with America in favour of closer engagement with Asia. Now, of course, Howard did not disagree with the policy of comprehensive engagement with Asia. He had his own he gave his own inflection to it, but he was very successful. Right. I mean, he tried to balance these two, you know, sort of forces in Australian foreign policy. But he said that the alliance will become more, not less important as the years go by. And that's fundamentally different to the language of Whitlam, Fraser, Hawke and Keating. He also talks about the alliance being more than a two-way street. But he's spoken publicly about the disappointment at not getting American boots on the ground in East Timor in '99. That's right. And I think that conversation with Clinton will be a fascinating record.
Well, he mentions a bit of that in his memoirs, I think, the tensions there between Alexander Downer and who was then the Foreign Minister for that Howard period, as well as the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. James, in closing, 60 years since the creation of the US alliance, 70 years since a Labor Prime Minister famously looked to America. What now for the future of the alliance? Do you think it will endure? And if so, how will it change if it does change?
I think it will endure. I mean, I think there is still, you know, a broad consensus across the political spectrum and in the Australian community that ANZUS is a good thing. I mean, it is still in many ways the sacred cow of Australian foreign policy. Now, there's no doubt, and I think Hugh White is absolutely spot on.
Hugh
White is the Professor of Strategic and International Studies at the Australian National University, that this balancing act of relying and cultivating the Chinese for Australia's economic prosperity and maintaining the close US alliance, particularly in Asia, it's going to become more difficult. And there needs to be more of a debate. It doesn't need to always revolve around this question of will there be blood, Australian blood spilt on the beaches. I mean, I think the Richard Armitage line of a few years ago shocked a few Australians.
Of course, Rich Armitage a few years ago was saying that if Australia weren't involved in the Taiwan Straits in the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, the alliance would be ruptured.
Yes, well, that's right, that's right. And I don't think that sort of language helps, nor do I think it helps for the odd Australian to go running around pledging, you know, unrequited love and loyalty to the Americans. I mean, I think we've gone beyond that, and Australia will have its own interests. But I think Hugh White is essentially right that that this debate needs to be busted open, and I think there's, you know, it's going to be a fascinating debate about how the alliance will need to change. But I think the path can be illuminated by considering in more detail
Here's a quote from the Australian government's Defence White Paper 2 years ago, and it said that we will be witnessing the beginning of the end of the so-called unipolar moment. That is the almost 2-decade-long period in which the preeminence of our principal ally, the United States, was without question. What's the significance of that?
Well, I mean, it was a contentious statement when it was first released in the Defence White Paper. I mean, my own feeling on this is that yes, I mean, look, it's clear that the United States does not have the clout that it once had in Asia, but nor do I see the US alliance system and the US presence diminishing in any significant way. And I also think that so often these statements underestimate the internal challenges that China faces with a growing middle class and you know, meeting the aspirations that growing middle class will have. I mean, I think that the Chinese still want an external environment in this region that doesn't hinder their internal development. You need to worry when that equilibrium starts to go out of kilter, when the Chinese see the external environment as being a threat. I think that's going to be a problem. So I think over the next 20 to 30 years, I mean, you can't doubt the Chinese military build-up. You can't doubt their growing economic strength. No one wants to turn a blind eye to that. It would be foolish to but at the same time, it needs to be put alongside these considerable domestic challenges.